Bong! The sound wave actually rippled the surface of my black coffee. I'm not exaggerating. I was standing on my own front porch, sipping a dark roast, and I literally felt the vibration rattle the fillings in my back molars. It was glorious. It was deafening. It was the sound of absolute, unadulterated victory. Down on the sidewalk, a golden retriever spun in a panicked circle. 3 houses down, Mr. Henderson's sprinkler system seemed to stutter, spitting a sad little hiss of water before resuming its arc. And there, storming up my freshly power-washed driveway, was Brenda. Brenda was the president of the Oak Creek Estates Homeowners Association, and she was currently moving with the terrifying kinetic energy of a heat-seeking missile. Her face was the exact shade of a boiled lobster. Her sensible orthopedic walking shoes slapped against the concrete. And in her right hand, gripped so tightly her knuckles were translucent, was the sacred HOA clipboard. "Turn! It! Off!" she shrieked, her voice cracking over the lingering, resonant hum of the brass. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. "Turn what off, Brenda?" That monstrosity!" She pointed a trembling finger at my front lawn. "I can't turn it off," I said, leaning casually against the porch railing. "It doesn't have a plug or a battery. It's completely manual. And honestly, I think it really ties the landscaping together." She looked like she was going to have an aneurysm right there next to my hydrangeas. But to fully understand how we reached this glorious crescendo of suburban warfare, we have to rewind the clock. Exactly 3 weeks, to be precise. Because 3 weeks ago, my lawn was peaceful. 3 weeks ago, Brenda and I were just 2 people who passively ignored each other. 3 weeks ago, I made the fatal mistake of hanging a clock on my own damn house. Let me paint you a picture of Oak Creek Estates. It's located in Annapolis, Maryland. It's the kind of neighborhood where people pay ungodly sums of money to live in houses that all look exactly the same, painted in exactly 3 approved shades of beige: desert sand, oatmeal, and depression. The lawns are manicured to the millimeter. If you leave your garbage cans out past 8 a.m. on a Wednesday, you get a nastygram taped to your door. It is coastal snobbery at its absolute peak. I bought a house here because I like the school district, and I tolerate the rules because I generally just want to be left alone to grill my steaks in peace. My patio is my sanctuary. Out back, I have a grill, a smoker, and a very nice cooler. But there was one problem. When you're out there flipping burgers, your hands are covered in grease and barbecue sauce. You can't exactly check your phone to see what time it is. So I bought an outdoor clock. Was it a little tacky? Look, I'll own it. Yes. It was a Margaritaville-style clock. It had a faux weathered wood background, a parrot in a Hawaiian shirt, and a bright neon green ring that lit up at night. It said, "It's 5 o'clock somewhere," in big, bold, unapologetic letters. I hung it on the side of my house, right above the gate to the backyard. Could you see it from the street? Technically, yes. If you were standing at the exact right angle, squinting past my neighbor's crepe myrtle tree, you could catch a glimpse of the neon green ring. Did it hurt anyone? Absolutely not. Did Brenda notice it within 48 hours? You bet your life she did. It was a Tuesday evening. I was watering my front flower beds when I heard the dreaded clip-clop of Brenda's shoes. I didn't even have to look up. I knew the cadence. "Evening, Brenda," I said, keeping the hose pointed firmly at the dirt. "It's an unapproved mechanical timekeeping display," she announced. No hello? No how are you? Just straight to the bylaws. I finally looked up. She was standing at the edge of my property line, holding the clipboard. She was wearing a visor. It was 6:30 p.m. The sun was practically gone. Why the visor? "I'm sorry, what?" I asked. "The thing on the side of your house." She wrinkled her nose like she had just smelled bad milk. "It is an eyesore. It violates Section 4, Paragraph B of the Community Aesthetic Guidelines." "Brenda, it's a clock." "It is an unapproved mechanical timekeeping display visible from the street," she corrected, her tone dripping with that specific, sickly sweet condescension reserved entirely for kindergarten teachers and HOA board members. "Remove it, or face a $100 daily fine." I stared at her. "It's 5 o'clock somewhere, Brenda." She didn't blink. "It will be a fine somewhere, too. You have 24 hours. She spun on her heel and marched away. I stood there, the hose dripping onto my sneakers, feeling my blood pressure slowly start to climb. $100 a day for a clock. A clock that told me when to take the ribs off the smoker. The rational part of my brain said, just take it down. It's not worth the fight. It's a stupid clock. So I did. That night I got out the stepladder, unhooked the parrot, and brought it inside. I threw it in the garage. I told myself I was being the bigger person. I told myself I was keeping the peace. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, it started to eat at me. Who does she think she is? Dictating the aesthetic of my side yard? Controlling how I tell time on my own property? The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. It wasn't about the clock anymore. It was about the principle. It was about the audacity. Am I going to let an HOA dictate how I know what time it is? Not a chance in hell. The next morning, I didn't go to work. I took a personal day. I brewed a massive pot of coffee, cracked my knuckles, and sat down at my dining room table. I pulled up the Oak Creek Estate's covenants, conditions, and restrictions. All 142 pages of them. If Brenda wanted to play by the book, we were going to play by the book. I was going to read every single word of this miserable document until I found a crack in her armor. I spent 4 hours drowning in legalese. Let me tell you, the things these people care about are genuinely unhinged. Did you know you aren't allowed to have a mailbox flag that isn't exactly cherry red? Did you know that if you plant a shrub, it must maintain a height of no less than 24 inches, but no more than 36? Did you know garden gnomes are explicitly banned under Section 8, subsection D, labeled whimsical distractions? It was exhausting. My eyes were crossing. But then, right there on page 68, I found it. The exact wording of my violation. No unapproved aesthetic structures or electronic/mechanical timekeeping displays shall be visible from the street. I read it once. I read it twice. I read it a third time, parsing the grammar like a linguist. Electronic, mechanical, displays. I leaned back in my chair. A slow, wicked grin started to spread across my face. Wait, what about manual timekeeping? What about auditory timekeeping? I scrambled to the end of the document. Every good legal contract has a severability clause, a little boilerplate text at the bottom that basically says, if this document contradicts actual laws, the actual laws win. And there it was, on page 141. No rule herein shall supersede Annapolis Municipal Code. Bingo. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I pulled up the Annapolis City Code. I went straight to the noise ordinances. I knew Annapolis was strict about noise. It's a historic town. They don't want people blasting subwoofers at 3 a.m. The code was brutal. Decibel limits, quiet hours, heavy fines. My heart sank a little. If I did something loud, the city would shut me down faster than Brenda could blink. But then I kept reading. I scrolled down to the exemptions. Exemptions to municipal noise ordinances, 11.12.040. My eyes scanned the list. Emergency vehicles, construction during business hours, municipal parades. And then, right there at the bottom of the list, buried in the rich, bureaucratic soil of Annapolis history, was the greatest sentence I have ever read in my entire life. Exception granted for traditional ship's bells, maritime signaling devices, and historic chimes, provided they are manually operated and serve a historically recognized signaling purpose. I pushed myself away from the table. I stood up. I started pacing the room. Annapolis is a sailing town. It's the sailing capital of the world. The Naval Academy is right down the road. They literally have maritime laws baked into their city code to protect the nautical aesthetic of the town. I looked at the HOA rules on one screen. I looked at the Annapolis City Code on the other. It was a beautiful, undeniable collision of bureaucratic nonsense. Brenda's rules banned electronic and mechanical timekeeping displays. The city code protected manual maritime signaling devices. I stopped pacing. I looked directly out my front window, visualizing my pristine, boring, meticulously edged front lawn. Do you know what isn't an electronic or mechanical timekeeping display? A guy hitting a 200-pound brass ship's bell with a mallet on the hour, every hour. It wasn't a display. It was a device. It wasn't mechanical. It was manual. And according to the HOA's own severability clause, Brenda couldn't do a damn thing about it without fighting the entire historic maritime municipality of Annapolis, Maryland. I grabbed my car keys. I had a busy afternoon ahead of me. I needed to go shopping. I didn't need a neon parrot. I needed heavy metal. I drove down to Eastport the very next morning. Honestly, if you've never been to the historic maritime district of Annapolis, you need to understand the vibe to really get what I was doing. It's basically a theme park for people who own 3 different pairs of boat shoes and use the word summer as a verb. Like, the sheer concentration of wealth and nautical nonsense is staggering. But tucked away behind a row of overpriced crab shacks and luxury yacht brokers, right on the edge of the water, there's this absolute dump of a salvage yard called Nautical Nostalgia. I guess the name is supposed to sound charming, but literally, it's just a mud pit filled with rusted anchors, rotting ship wheels, and the ghosts of dead trawlers. I parked my truck, stepped over a puddle that smelled strongly of low tide and diesel fuel, and walked into the main office. The guy running the place looked like he had been constructed entirely out of beef jerky and old fishing nets. He was sitting behind a desk covered in brass fittings, smoking a cigar that definitely violated at least 4 fire codes. "I need a bell," I said, leaning on the counter. He didn't even look up from the rusty winch he was polishing. "Got bells. Little ones. For dinner tables. Ring for the butler, that sort of crap." "No," I said, shaking my head. "I mean, I need a bell, like a ship's bell, something big. Something that you ring when the fog is so thick you can't see the bow of the boat. Something that makes you feel it in your chest cavity." He finally stopped polishing and looked at me. He had one eye that tracked a little slower than the other, which honestly just made him look more authentic. "You putting it on a schooner?" "I'm putting it in my front yard." He stared at me for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then, a slow, gravelly chuckle rumbled out of his chest. "Follow me, son." We walked out into the yard, navigating through mazes of fiberglass hulls and stacked lobster traps. Way in the back, sitting on a wooden pallet under a blue tarp, was the Holy Grail. He pulled the tarp back, and I literally gasped. It was massive. It was solid brass, slightly tarnished green around the edges from decades of salt spray, but it was beautiful. It had to be at least 2 feet across at the base. "Salvaged off a commercial icebreaker up in Maine back in the 90s, the jerky guy rasped, slapping the side of it. It let out a dull, heavy thunk. "Weighs about 220 pounds. Solid cast. You hit this thing with a proper mallet, they'll hear it in the next county. Needs a new clapper, though, or you just hit it from the outside." "How much?" I asked, already reaching for my wallet. $800, he said. I mean, I'll be honest, that was about $700 more than I wanted to spend. But then I pictured Brenda's face. I pictured her sensible orthopedic shoes vibrating off her feet. "Do you take Apple Pay?" Getting it into the bed of my truck required me, the jerky guy, a forklift, and a lot of swearing. But an hour later, I was driving back to Oak Creek Estates with a weapon of mass auditory destruction strapped down with bungee cords. Now, a 220-pound brass icebreaker bell isn't exactly something you can hang from a plastic command hook. I needed infrastructure. I needed engineering. More importantly, I needed a guy who didn't ask too many questions, but knew his way around heavy timber and quick-set concrete. Enter Sal. Sal is a local marine contractor. He builds docks, retaining walls, bulkheads. Basically, he builds things meant to withstand hurricanes. He's also a guy who communicates almost entirely in grunts and heavy sighs. I called him up, offered him double his hourly rate for an emergency Saturday job, and told him to bring his post-hole digger. When Sal pulled his beat-up flatbed into my driveway, the HOA spidey senses of Oak Creek Estates immediately started tingling. I could practically see the blinds twitching across the street. Commercial vehicles weren't allowed parked in driveways for more than 4 hours, according to Section 12. Sal didn't care. Sal stepped out of his truck wearing a stained Carhartt t-shirt, took a long sip from a giant thermos of coffee, and walked over to the bed of my truck to look at the bell. He stared at it. He looked at me. He looked at my perfectly manicured, aggressively boring front lawn. "So," Sal said, his voice sounding like a cement mixer. "Let me get this straight. You want me to sink 2 6x6 pressure-treated posts right into the middle of your front lawn, and you want me to build a crossbeam to hold a 200-pound icebreaker bell." "That is correct, Sal," I said cheerfully. "Why exactly?" "Because I need to know when it's noon, Sal." Sal paused. He slowly reached into his pocket, pulled out a rag, wiped his hands, and then deliberately looked down at my left wrist. "You're wearing an Apple Watch." "I am," I agreed. "And you have a smartphone in your pocket." "Also true." "So you want to destroy $1,000 worth of prime Kentucky bluegrass, pour concrete footers, and hang a piece of naval salvage 50 feet from the street?" "Yes." Sal took another sip of his coffee. He looked across the street, right at Brenda's house. I swear he actually saw the curtains move. Sal had been dealing with Annapolis HOAs his entire career. He knew exactly what this was. I could see the gears turning in his head, calculating the sheer volume of petty spite required to commission this project. "Sal," I said, leaning in just a bit, "do you want the check or not?" A faint, rare smile cracked across Sal's weathered face. "I'll get the post-hole digger. Where do you want the center point?" For the next 4 hours, my front yard became a construction zone. Sal didn't mess around. He dug 2 massive holes, 36 inches deep, right in the center of the lawn. He dropped in the heavy, marine-grade 6x6 timbers. He mixed bags of quikrete right there on the grass, pouring it into the holes and leveling the posts with aggressive precision. Every time his auger ground into the dirt, I swear I could feel the collective anxiety of the neighborhood rising. Brenda didn't come out. I knew why. Technically, under the CC&Rs, temporary landscaping modifications and weekend construction were permitted between the hours of 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. She couldn't fine me for the construction itself. She was waiting to see what the final product was, so she could throw the book at me. By 3 p.m., Sal was hoisting the bell using a block and tackle rig attached to his truck. He bolted it to the thick crossbeam using galvanized steel hardware that could probably hold up a small car. When he finally unhooked the straps and stepped back, we both just stood there, staring at it. It looked absurd. It looked glorious. It looked like I was preparing to summon a kraken right there in the middle of Oak Creek Estates. "She's solid," Sal grunted, slapping the timber frame. "You could hit that bell with a sledgehammer. The frame won't budge." "Sal, you are a true artist," I said, handing him an envelope full of cash. "You're a crazy person," he replied, pocketing the money. "But God bless you." He packed up his truck and rolled out, leaving me alone with the brass behemoth. The infrastructure was in place. The weapon was loaded. But I had a serious logistical problem. I have a job. Like, a real job that requires me to be on Zoom calls, analyze spreadsheets, and occasionally leave the house to buy groceries. I couldn't just stand in my front yard all day, acting as the neighborhood's personal Big Ben. If this was going to work, and if it was going to strictly adhere to the Manual Operation Clause of Municipal Code 11.12.040, I needed human capital. I went inside, booted up my laptop, and went straight to the student job board for Anne Arundel Community College. I paid the $20 listing fee and posted a gig. Job title: Historical Maritime Signaling Technician. Hours: 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Weekends included. Shifts available. Pay: $20 per hour requirements. Punctuality: strong upper body, deep appreciation for malicious compliance, and a willingness to stand in a front yard. Duties: you will strike a saw, brass bell, once for 1 o'clock, twice for 2 o'clock, etc. Do not apply if you are afraid of angry neighbors. Honestly, I thought it would take days to get a response. I got 3 within the first hour. The job market is tough out there, I guess. I set up interviews on my back patio for Sunday morning. The first guy who showed up was a business major named Chad, who asked if there was any way we could automate the process using a Raspberry Pi and a servo motor so he could just work from home. I had to explain to Chad that automating it was literally the one thing that made it illegal. Chad was out. The second candidate was a guy wearing a sleeveless tap-out shirt who asked if he was allowed to headbutt the bell instead of using a mallet. I politely declined. And then, at 11:30 a.m., candidate number 3 walked through the gate. Enter Kyle. Kyle was 20 years old. He was wearing cargo shorts, a perfectly ironed polo shirt, and wire-rimmed glasses. He carried a leather-bound portfolio. He sat down across from me at the patio table, opened his portfolio, and handed me a professionally printed resume on heavy cardstock. "Kyle," I said, glancing over the paper, "it says here, you are a sophomore majoring in avant-garde theatrical performance." "That is correct, sir," Kyle said, his posture absolutely perfect. "I specialize in immersive, durational performance art. When I saw your listing, I immediately recognized the artistic merit of the project. A solitary figure, bound by the relentless march of time, manually announcing the hours to an indifferent suburban landscape. It's a profound commentary on the human condition. I stared at him. Kyle? My HOA president made me take down a Margaritaville clock, so I'm exploiting a municipal loophole to ruin her life. Kyle didn't even blink. He just nodded solemnly. The best art is rooted in conflict, sir. Do you have a watch? He proudly held up his wrist, displaying a heavy, tactical-looking digital watch. Atomic timekeeping, synced daily to the Naval Observatory. Kyle, I said, feeling a genuine wave of emotion wash over me. You're hired. Can you start tomorrow? I would be honored, he said. He paused, looking down at his polo shirt. Is there a uniform? I feel the piece would have more impact if I wore something official, perhaps high-visibility safety gear to emphasize the maritime safety aspect of the signaling device. I could have kissed him. Kyle, I will buy you the brightest neon green safety vest Amazon has to offer. We spent the next hour doing a dry run. I had purchased a heavy rubber mallet with a wooden handle, the kind you use for laying paving stones. It was heavy enough to produce a massive sound, but the rubber meant it wouldn't dent the antique brass. I stood on the porch, coaching him like a boxing trainer. Okay, Kyle, it's almost noon. Walk me through your process. Kyle stood next to the bell, wearing his new high-vis vest, clutching the mallet. He looked at his watch. At 1 minute to the hour, I approached the signaling device. I assume a wide stands for stability. He spread his legs, looking incredibly serious. Good posture. Now, what's the strike pattern? Firm, deliberate strikes, Kyle recited. Not too fast. 1 second between impacts to allow the resonance to carry. Let's see a practice swing. Don't hit it yet. He wound up, pulling the mallet back in a sweeping theatrical arc, and stopped it an inch from the brass. It was beautiful. The kid had a flair for the dramatic. Perfect, I told him. Tomorrow is Monday. The real test begins. Brenda usually leaves for her morning power walk right around 7:45 a.m., which means she will be walking right past this house right as the clock strikes 8. That is your premiere, Kyle. You are the vanguard. I won't let you down, sir, Kyle said, adjusting his glasses. That night, I barely slept. I was practically vibrating with anticipation. I felt like a general on the eve of a major offensive. I had read the laws, I had built the infrastructure, I had assembled the personnel. All that was left was the execution. I had a feeling the Oak Creek Estates Homeowners Association was about to have a very, very loud awakening. Monday morning dawned crisp and clear. It was a beautiful summer day in Annapolis. The birds were chirping. The distant hum of lawnmowers echoed from a few streets over. It was the picture of suburban tranquility. At 7:40 a.m., Kyle arrived. He parked his battered Honda Civic perfectly legally on the street. He stepped out, already wearing the high-vis vest. He marched up the driveway, gave me a crisp nod, and took his position next to the bell. He stood at parade rest, the mallet held loosely in his right hand. I poured myself a cup of dark roast coffee and stepped out onto the porch. I didn't sit down. You don't sit down for something like this. At 7:48 a.m., right on schedule, the front door of the beige house across the street opened. Brenda stepped out. She was wearing a matching hot pink tracksuit, a white visor, and carrying a pair of those little 3-pound dumbbells people pump while they walk. She locked her front door, turned around, and froze. From her angle, the massive timber structure and the 200-pound brass bell were perfectly framed against the morning sun, and standing right next to it was a 20-year-old theater major in a neon vest, staring blankly ahead. She dropped one of her dumbbells, It hit the concrete driveway with a dull clatter. Brenda narrowed her eyes. I saw her chest puff up. She took one aggressive step down her driveway, clearly preparing to march over and demand an explanation for the bizarre modern art installation I had erected over the weekend. I looked at my watch. It was 7:59 and 45 seconds. "Kyle," I said softly from the porch. "Ready, sir," Kyle whispered back, never taking his eyes off the horizon. Brenda reached the end of her driveway. She planted her hands on her hips, her mouth opening to shout across the asphalt. 5, I counted down. 4, 3, 2, 1, strike! Kyle shifted his weight. He pulled the mallet back in a gorgeous, sweeping arc, his high-vis vest catching the sun, and brought it down against the side of the icebreaker bell with the force of a minor deity. Gong! The sound didn't just travel, it exploded. It was a deep, resonant baritone shockwave that seemed to suck the air out of the cul-de-sac. The physical vibration hit me in the chest. A flock of starlings exploded out of a nearby oak tree in absolute panic. Gong. 2. Brenda physically recoiled, throwing her hands up over her ears. Her mouth was moving, but the sheer volume of the brass completely swallowed whatever she was screaming. Gong. 3. Kyle was a machine. His timing was impeccable. Exactly 1 second between strikes. The resonance was building on itself, creating a sustained, vibrating hum that made my teeth itch. Gong. 4. A car alarm went off 2 driveways down. A beagle started howling from an open window. Gong. 5. Brenda was now speed-walking toward my property line, her face contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She was waving her remaining pink dumbbell in the air like a club. Gong. 6. Kyle didn't even flinch. He didn't look at her. He remained locked in his artistic trance. Gong. 7. I took a sip of my coffee. It tasted like victory and petty revenge. Gong. 8. Kyle brought the mallet to his side, returning to parade rest. The bell continued to hum, a deep, lingering reverberation that slowly faded into the morning air. The silence that followed was heavy. It felt like the aftermath of an explosion. Brenda was standing exactly 1 inch from my property line. Her visor was slightly askew. Her face was no longer red. It had crossed into a terrifying shade of purple. "What?" she screamed, her voice cracking. "Is that?" I leaned casually against the porch railing. "Morning, Brenda. That is a manually operated maritime signaling device. I believe the proper term is an icebreaker bell." "Are you out of your mind?" she shrieked, gesturing wildly at Kyle, who was currently staring straight ahead, completely unbothered. "You cannot do that! It is 8 a.m. You are vibrating my windows!" "Actually," I said, putting my coffee mug down on the railing and pulling a folded piece of paper from my back pocket. I had highlighted the relevant sections in bright yellow. If you check the Annapolis Municipal Code, Noise Ordinance 11.12.040 explicitly protects the operation of traditional ships' bells and maritime signaling devices, provided they are manually operated and serve a historically recognized signaling purpose, like, for instance, marking the hour. "I don't care about the city code," she yelled, actually stomping her foot. "This is Oak Creek Estates. We have bylaws. You are violating the ban on mechanical timekeeping displays." I smiled. It was the smile of a man who had done his homework. "Ah, but Brenda, as we discussed last week, this is not mechanical. It requires no gears, no electricity, no springs. It is entirely manual." I gestured to Kyle. This is Kyle. He is a local artisan I've contracted to operate the device. Kyle gave a curt, professional nod, but did not break character. And furthermore, I continued, it is not a display. You don't look at it to tell the time. You listen to it. It is an auditory signal. Therefore, it does not fall under the purview of Section 4, Paragraph B. Brenda stared at me, her chest heaving. She was trying to find a hole in the logic, but the sheer absurdity of the situation had clearly short-circuited her brain. It is an eyesore. It's a nuisance. I will fine you $100 a day. You can try, I said softly. But as I'm sure you know, the severability clause on page 141 of your own CC&Rs clearly states that no HOA rule shall supersede Annapolis Municipal Code. And the city of Annapolis, in its infinite wisdom and dedication to nautical history, says my bell is perfectly legal. We will see about that, she spat, pointing a shaking finger at me. I am calling the police. I am calling code enforcement. I am going to have that boy arrested for disturbing the peace. You do what you have to do, Brenda, I said, picking my coffee back up. Just a heads up, though. Kyle goes on his union-mandated water break at 1:45, but he'll be back at his post promptly for the 9 a.m. strike. 9 bells, Brenda. It's going to be a loud one. She let out a sound that was half scream, half growl, spun on her heel, and marched back across the street, slamming her front door so hard I thought the glass would shatter. I looked over at Kyle. He was standing perfectly still, but I could see the faintest hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Excellent work, Kyle, I said. Pacing was perfect. Resonance was optimal. Thank you, sir, Kyle said. I felt the emotional weight of the 8th strike really connected with the audience. It certainly did, I laughed. Take a break, kid. Sit on the porch. The cops will probably be here in about 20 minutes, and I want you to look completely relaxed when they pull up. Honestly, I was terrified the cops were going to shut me down. I had the law on my side, sure, but police officers don't usually appreciate amateur legal scholars quoting municipal codes at them at 8 in the morning. If they decided I was a nuisance, they could haul me in on a general disorderly conduct charge and let a judge sort it out later. I was playing a dangerous game of chicken. Sure enough, at exactly 8:35 a.m., an Annapolis Police Department cruiser turned onto our street. It rolled slowly past Brenda's house, where I could see her standing in the front window, practically pressing her face against the glass, pointing aggressively toward my yard. The cruiser pulled up to my curb. The lights weren't flashing, but the presence was heavy. 2 officers got out. They looked tired. They had that specific look of cops who had just spent the night shift breaking up fights at downtown bars and were absolutely not in the mood to deal with suburban HOA drama. They walked up the driveway. They looked at the massive timber frame. They looked at the brass bell. They looked at Kyle, who was sitting on the porch steps drinking a Gatorade, still wearing his high-vis vest. Morning, officers, I said, walking down the steps to meet them. The older officer, a guy with salt and pepper hair and a name tag that read Miller, sighed heavily. Sir, we got a call from your neighbor across the street. She says you're operating an illegal noise-making device and intentionally disturbing the peace. I am operating a maritime signaling device, Officer Miller, I said politely. Manually. Officer Miller looked at the bell. That's a ship's bell. An icebreaker bell, to be specific, salvaged off the coast of Maine. The younger officer, who couldn't have been much older than Kyle, snorted. He quickly covered his mouth, trying to look professional. Sir, Miller said, rubbing the bridge of his nose, why do you have a 200-pound ship's bell in your front yard? Because my Homeowners Association threatened to fine me $100 a day for having a neon Margaritaville clock on my patio, I said, maintaining complete eye contact. They banned electronic and mechanical timekeeping displays, so I switched to an analog auditory method to remain compliant. Miller stared at me. He looked over at Brenda's house. He looked back at me. I could see the exact moment he realized what was happening. It was the look of a man who suddenly realized he had stepped into a war zone of petty spite that was way above his pay grade. Sir, regardless of your HOA feud, you can't just ring a massive bell in a residential neighborhood. It violates the noise ordinance. Actually, I said, pulling the laminated printout of the Annapolis Municipal Code from my back pocket and handing it to him. I believe I am fully exempt. Miller took the paper. He read it. He frowned. He read it again. He handed it to his partner. The younger cop read it, and a huge grin spread across his face. Section 11.12.040, the younger cop whispered. The historic maritime exemption. Exactly, I said. We are currently located within the Annapolis city limits, correct? Technically, yes, Miller admitted reluctantly. And the device is manually operated for the historically recognized purpose of marking the hour? I gestured to Kyle. Kyle here is the operator. He strikes the bell on the hour, every hour, from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Miller looked at Kyle. You're getting paid to hit that thing? $20 an hour, sir, Kyle said brightly. It's a performance art piece. Miller closed his eyes for a long, agonizing second. He handed the laminated sheet back to me. He took a deep breath. Sir, is it loud? It is aggressively loud, officer. And you're going to do this every hour? Until Brenda gives me a written variance for my Margaritaville clock, yes. Miller looked across the street again. Brenda was now standing on her front porch, arms crossed, tapping her foot, clearly waiting for the officers to slap the cuffs on me. Miller looked back at me, shook his head, and let out a short, defeated laugh. Okay, Miller said. Here's the deal. According to this specific municipal code, which I am absolutely going to have to verify with the shift lieutenant when I get back to the precinct, you aren't technically breaking a city law, assuming you don't ring it before 8 a.m. or after 8 p.m. I would never, I said, putting my hand over my heart. However, Miller continued, pointing a stern finger at me, this is a civil matter between you and your HOA. If she decides to sue you, that's on you. If she gets the board to rewrite the bylaws, that's on you. We aren't getting involved. Do not call us back here unless someone is bleeding. Understood perfectly, officer. Miller turned to his partner. Come on, let's go tell the nice lady across the street that Annapolis loves its nautical history. I watched them walk across the street. I watched Officer Miller pull out his notepad and start explaining the situation to Brenda. I watched Brenda's arms uncross. I watched her point frantically at my house, at the sky, at the police cruiser. I watched Officer Miller shrug, tip his hat, and walk away. Brenda stood there on her lawn, utterly defeated, as the police car drove away. I looked at my watch. It was 8:58 a.m. I turned to Kyle. Warm up the shoulder, Kyle. It's almost 9 o'clock. Kyle hit the bell exactly 9 times at 9 o'clock. Honestly, I think the 9th strike was even louder than the 8th. Brenda didn't even come outside for that one. I just saw her living room blinds snap shut with the violent force of a rat trap. For the next 3 days, my front yard was the main attraction of Oak Creek Estates. Kyle was an absolute machine. He never missed a strike. He brought a little folding camp chair and a cooler, sitting there reading Stanislavski's An Actor Prepares Between Shifts. The neighborhood kids started treating him like a minor celebrity. They would ride their bikes over at 10 to the hour, line up on the sidewalk, and count down the strikes with him. The UPS driver honked his horn in solidarity when he drove by, but not everyone was a fan. Obviously. By Wednesday afternoon, the tension in the cul-de-sac was thicker than the humidity. I was sitting at my kitchen island, typing up an email for work, when I heard a sharp, aggressive knock at my front door. I didn't even have to look through the peephole. I knew that knock. I opened the door. Brenda wasn't there, but taped to the wood at exactly eye level was a bright pink laminated piece of paper. It was an official summons. Emergency Board Meeting. Oak Creek Estates. HOA. Thursday, 7 p.m. Community Clubhouse. Mandatory. Attendance for lot at 42. My house. I pulled the pink slip off the door. An emergency meeting. She was actually doing it. She couldn't get the cops to arrest me. She couldn't fine me under the current bylaws, so she was going to change the rules of the game. She was going to try and rewrite the CC&Rs to ban my brass masterpiece. I guess she thought I would be intimidated. I mean, going up against a full HOA board in their home territory is usually a death sentence for a homeowner. They hold all the cards. They have the gavel. But Brenda forgot one critical detail. I didn't just read the aesthetic guidelines. I read the entire document. And then I read the state laws that governed her document. I spent Thursday afternoon preparing my arsenal. I went to Staples. I bought a 3-inch heavy-duty black binder. I printed out the HOA bylaws, the Annapolis Municipal Code, and the Maryland Homeowners Association Act. I bought a set of multicolored sticky tabs. I color-coded my cross-references. By the time 6:45 p.m. rolled around, I was holding a legal weapon that weighed about 4 pounds. I walked down the street to the community clubhouse. It's this sad little building next to the neighborhood pool that always smells faintly of chlorine and stale Folgers coffee. I pushed the glass doors open. The room was set up like a tribunal. Brenda was sitting at the exact center of a long folding table, flanked by the rest of the board. To her right was Gary, the treasurer, a guy who looked like he had been asleep since 1998. To her left was Martha, the secretary, who was clutching a pen so tightly her knuckles were white. About 20 other neighbors were sitting in folding chairs, muttering to each other. The room went dead silent when I walked in. I didn't sit in the back. I walked right up to the front row, dropped my massive black binder onto a chair with a loud, heavy thwack, and sat down. Brenda glared at me. She picked up a wooden gavel. She literally brought a gavel, I am not making this up, and slammed it against the plastic folding table. I call this emergency meeting of the Oak Creek Estates Homeowners Association to order, she announced, her voice echoing off the cheap acoustic ceiling tiles. We are bypassing the standard agenda to address an immediate catastrophic nuisance occurring on Lot 42. She pointed the gavel directly at me. The homeowner in question has erected a massive, unauthorized, deeply offensive auditory structure in his front lawn, Brenda continued, addressing the room but never taking her eyes off me. He is utilizing a loophole in our aesthetic guidelines to circumvent our authority. This will not stand. I leaned back in my folding chair. I crossed my arms. I gave her a polite little nod to continue. I have drafted an emergency amendment to Section 4, Paragraph B of the Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions, Brenda said, pulling a piece of paper from her folder. This amendment will ban all exterior auditory signaling devices, including but not limited to bells, chimes, gongs, sirens, and whistles. It will be effective immediately upon a board vote. A murmur went through the crowd. Some people nodded. Some people looked incredibly uncomfortable. Do I have a motion to vote on the amendment? Brenda asked, looking at Martha. Martha nervously cleared her throat. I motion to vote. Seconded, Gary mumbled, barely opening his eyes. Before we vote, Brenda said, a victorious, venomous smirk creeping onto her face. She looked down at me like I was a bug on her windshield. Does the homeowner from Lot 42 have any comments? Any apologies, perhaps? Any promises to dismantle the nuisance before the fines begin? I uncrossed my arms. I leaned forward. I slowly, deliberately opened my massive black binder. The snap of the metal rings echoed in the quiet room. I do have a comment, Brenda, I said, keeping my voice calm, conversational, and loud enough for everyone to hear. I have a few, actually. Make it quick, she snapped. Oh, it'll be quick, I said. I flipped to a page marked with a bright red sticky tab. So, you want to amend the CC&Rs to ban my bell. That's a bold move. Have you by any chance reviewed the Maryland Homeowners Association Act regarding the restriction of historically protected municipal items? Brenda's smirk faltered slightly. This is a private community. We have the right to govern our own aesthetics. You do, I agreed, nodding reasonably. To an extent, but my bell is protected under Annapolis Municipal Code 11.12.040. It is a recognized historic maritime signaling device, which brings us to Maryland state law. I traced my finger down the page. According to the Maryland HOA Act, if an association attempts to pass a covenant restriction that explicitly overrides a protected municipal historic exemption, you cannot do it via an emergency board vote. Brenda stiffened. Excuse me? You can't just vote on it tonight, I said, my voice dripping with fake sympathy. State law says that to restrict a protected historic municipal item, you must provide a 60-day written notice to all residents. Then, you have to apply for a variance with the Annapolis City Zoning Board, which involves a public hearing. The room was completely silent. You could hear the hum of the vending machine in the hallway. And, I continued, flipping to a yellow sticky tab. The best part is, according to your own governing documents, Article 9, Section 3, concerning modifications that require city zoning involvement, the board cannot pass the amendment with a simple majority. It requires a unanimous vote from the board of directors. I closed the binder. I looked directly at Gary. Gary, the sleepy treasurer, suddenly looked very awake. He was staring at me. Then he looked at Brenda. Is this true? Gary asked, his voice gravelly. Brenda was scrambling through her own papers, her face turning that familiar, terrifying shade of purple. He's twisting the law. It's a loophole. We govern this neighborhood, not him. Brenda, Gary said, holding up a hand. Did you look into the state law before you called us all here on a Thursday night? I am trying to protect our property values, Gary, she shrieked. That thing goes off 13 times a day. He has a teenager in a construction vest hitting it with a hammer. Actually, he's a theater major, I corrected helpfully. And his name is Kyle. He's very professional. A woman in the third row let out a loud, abrupt laugh, then quickly covered her mouth. Gary rubbed his temples. Brenda, are you telling me that to get rid of this bell, we have to file paperwork with the city, wait 2 months, go to a public zoning hearing, and then vote on it? Yes, Brenda yelled. And we will! No, Gary said flatly. We won't. Brenda whipped her head around to look at him. What do you mean, no? I mean I'm not doing that, Gary said, leaning back in his chair. I am not spending my retirement going to city council meetings to argue about a boat bell. I told you last week you shouldn't have made a big deal about his backyard clock. It was behind a gate. Nobody cared. I cared, Brenda yelled. It was Tacky. And now he's got Big Ben in his front yard, Gary shot back. And honestly, I think it's kind of funny. Checkmate. Gary, Brenda gasped, looking completely betrayed. I'm not voting for the amendment, Gary said, crossing his arms. Which means you don't have a unanimous vote, which means the amendment fails. He looked over at me. Can you tell your kid to skip the 8 a.m. ring on weekends, though? My wife likes to sleep in. I'll have Kyle start at 9 a.m. on Saturdays and Sundays, I said graciously. I'm a reasonable man, Gary. Brenda looked like she was going to spontaneously combust. She looked at Martha. Martha was staring at her shoes, avoiding eye contact at all costs. She looked at the crowd of neighbors, a few of whom were now openly smirking. She slammed the gavel down one more time, but it lacked any real authority. It just sounded sad. Meeting adjourned, she hissed through gritted teeth. She grabbed her folders, stood up so fast she knocked her folding chair over, and stormed out of the clubhouse. I stayed in my seat for a minute. Gary looked over at me and gave me a very slow, very subtle nod. I nodded back. I picked up my massive black binder. It felt significantly lighter now. I walked out of the clubhouse and into the warm summer night air. I could hear the crickets chirping. I could smell the distant scent of someone firing up a charcoal grill. It was peaceful. I checked my watch. It was 7:45 p.m. Kyle was going to ring the final bell of the day in 15 minutes. I wanted to be there for it. I wanted to stand on my porch, drink a beer, and feel the resonance of absolute victory. The next 2 weeks were a strange, beautiful new normal in Oak Creek Estates. Kyle became a permanent fixture. He actually started bringing a tot, thermos of iced tea, and sharing it with the mailman. The neighborhood dogs got used to the sound and stopped barking. Even Mr. Henderson's sprinkler system seemed to adjust to the vibrations. Brenda practically became a ghost. She stopped doing her morning power walks. She didn't send out a single HOA violation notice. The clipboard was nowhere to be seen. Rumor had it she was desperately consulting with real estate attorneys in Baltimore, trying to find a way to overrule the Maryland HOA Act. But every lawyer she called basically laughed her off the phone. But honestly, I wasn't doing this just to torture her forever. I mean, don't get me completely wrong. Torturing her was a massive, incredible bonus. But the bell was loud. It was annoying when I was trying to watch a movie in my living room. And paying Kyle $20 an hour, 12 hours a day, was starting to dig a serious hole in my savings account. I had made my point. I had proven the concept. Now, it was time for the exit strategy. It was time for the negotiation. It happened on a Tuesday. I was out front, watering the hydrangeas, which were looking fantastic, by the way, when I heard the familiar, hesitant clip-clop of sensible orthopedic shoes. I didn't look up right away. I kept the hose focused on the dirt. "Hello, Brenda," I said. "Hello," she replied. Her voice was incredibly quiet. The venom was completely gone. She sounded exhausted. I turned off the hose and looked at her. She wasn't wearing her visor. She was holding a single piece of paper, not the dreaded clipboard. She looked at the massive timber frame. She looked at the brass bell. She looked at Kyle, who was sitting in his camp chair reading a script for a streetcar named Desire. "Can we talk?" she asked. "My property is always open for neighborly dialogue, Brenda," I said, wiping my hands on my jeans. She took a deep breath. She looked physically pained, like the words she was about to say were coated in shattered glass. I have drafted a document." "Oh?" I raised an eyebrow. "Another emergency amendment?" "No," she said quickly. "No. It is a variance, a permanent, written, irrevocable variance." She held out the piece of paper. I didn't take it immediately. I just looked at it. A variance for what, exactly? I asked. For the clock, she said, practically whispering. The Margaritaville clock. The one on your patio. I crossed my arms. The tacky, unapproved, mechanical timekeeping display? Yes, she said, closing her eyes for a second. I have signed it. The board has signed it. It grants you a permanent exception to Section 4, Paragraph B. You can put the clock back up. You can leave it up all year. You can turn the neon ring on whenever you want. We will never cite you for it again. I finally reached out and took the paper. I read it over. It was ironclad. It had the official HOA seal stamped at the bottom. This is very generous of you, Brenda, I said. In exchange, she said, her voice trembling slightly as she pointed a finger at the massive brass bell. You take that monstrosity down, and you fire the boy in the vest. His name is Kyle, I reminded her. And he's not fired. His contract is simply concluding. Will you take it down? She asked, her eyes pleading. I looked at the bell. I looked at the variance in my hand. I thought about my bank account. Was it worth keeping the bell just to spite her? Probably. But was I ready to grill some ribs and look at my neon parrot again? Absolutely. Brenda, I said, offering her my hand. We have a deal. I'll call Sal the contractor. The bell will be gone by tomorrow afternoon. She didn't shake my hand. She just let out a massive, shuddering sigh of relief, turned around, and walked back across the street. Her shoulders were slumped. The reign of terror was officially over. I walked over to Kyle. He marked his page in his script and looked up at me. Kyle, I said, the war is won. The armistice has been signed. Kyle slowly stood up. He looked at the bell. He looked at the rubber mallet in his hand. My durational performance has reached its natural conclusion? It has, buddy, I said, clapping him on the shoulder. You did amazing work. I am going to write you the greatest letter of recommendation Anne Arundel Community College has ever seen. I'm going to talk about your punctuality, your dedication, and your unwavering commitment to maritime safety. Kyle smiled. It was a genuine, bright smile. Thank you, sir. It was an honor. You want to do the honors one last time? I asked, checking my watch. It's a minute to noon. 12 bells. I would love nothing more, Kyle said. He put his high-vis vest back on. He assumed his wide stance. He took a deep breath, perfectly centering himself. At exactly 12 o'clock, he swung the mallet. Gong. It echoed through Oak Creek Estates one last time. It was the sound of a loophole successfully exploited. It was the sound of a tyrant brought to her knees. It was the sound of sweet, glorious, malicious compliance. That evening, after Sal came and ripped the timber out of the ground, I went into my garage. I dusted off the Margaritaville clock. I got my stepladder. I walked out to the patio and hung it right back where it belonged. I plugged it in. The neon green ring hummed to life, glowing brightly against the siding of my house. I fired up the grill. I threw a steak on the grates. I cracked open a cold beer, leaned back, and looked at my clock. It was 5 p.m. Exactly. So, what's the lesson here, folks? The lesson is that tyrants thrive on ignorance. People like Brenda rely on the fact that you won't read the fine print. They rely on the fact that you will just roll over and pay the $100 fine because it's easier than fighting. But when you read the fine print, when you actually look at the severability clauses, the municipal codes, and the state laws, you realize that their power is an illusion. It's a house of cards held together by a clipboard and a bad attitude. Never let them bully you. Never let them tell you what time it is. If they push you, you don't just push back. You find a 200-pound piece of naval salvage, hire a theater major, and you ring the bell until they surrender. This has been sovereign authority. Keep reading the bylaws, keep finding the loopholes, and whatever you do, never apologize for the neon parrot.